Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 74, Part 1, Mary Hyde. Mary Ann Hyde was born in Worcestershire, England on the 19th of February 1779. She was the eldest child of Edward Hyde and Sarah Blunn. Mary also had three younger siblings, John, William and Anne. Mary Hyde was transported as a convict to Australia. In November 1795, at the age of 16, Mary was accused of stealing items of clothing from Francis Deacon, her employer, including one black silk cloak, one muslin shawl, one cotton gown, one dimity petticoat, two pairs of cotton stockings, and a pair of scissors. On the 21st of March 1796, at the age of 17, Mary, who used her mother's name as an alias, was sentenced at the Warwickshire Assizes to 7 years' transportation to New South Wales for theft. She was not transported until 1798. On the 18th of July 1798, Mary arrived in Sydney on board the Britannia, a whaling ship that had also previously brought convicts to Sydney in May 1797. Females were in short supply in the colony, and the competition for newly arrived female convicts on that day was described by David Collins in an account of an English colony in New South Wales as like a cattle auction. The lot of the women who arrived that day was to be a servant or a wife to a stranger, or a hut keeper for convict males at Parramatta. In August 1798, when they were both 19 years old, Mary met John Black, a ship's officer. John Black was born on the 31st of October 1778 in Norfolk, England, and he was the son of Reverend John Black and Mary Logie. In about 1795, at the age of 17, and looking for adventure, John Black joined the ship the Walpole, an East Indiaman trader. Nothing more is known about his naval career until May 1797. On the 1st of May 1797, John Black wrote to his father that he was at Torbay, Devon, England, on board the Lady Shore. John Black was the purser and the navigator, and Lady Shore was bound for Sydney, then known as Port Jackson, with soldiers for the New South Wales Corps. Lieutenant William Minchin, commanding officer of the detachment, a consignment of 69 female convicts and one male convict, and much-needed supplies of food and farm implements for the colony of New South Wales. Black also informed his father that the soldiers were the most disagreeable, mutinous set of villains that have ever entered into a ship. With good reason, mutinous because an attempt had already been made to seize the ship to avoid it arriving at its destination, and disagreeable villains because two of the sergeants had already needed to be placed in irons. Many of the soldiers in the detachment being sent to New South Wales were not there from choice, and one of the attempted mutineers had stated that he had been sent on board by force from a police officer. The detachment of troops included French and Irish prisoners of war, deserters avoiding the military discipline of a court-martial, and prisoners from the Savoy Palace in London. 8 weeks after the Lady Shore had sailed from Falmouth, the mutiny began. In the early morning of the 1st of August 1797, when the Lady Shore was about 4 days at sail from Rio de Janeiro, the soldiers and several of the sailors mutinied. During the fray, John Black fired his pistol, which took one of the mutineers' hats off, but was not able to do more damage. The mutineers quickly took over the ship. They killed Captain Wilcox and the chief mate Lambert. All those not in the mutiny, including the soldiers' officers and some privates, were imprisoned below deck. 2 weeks later, during the late afternoon of Monday 15th of August 1797, John Black and 28 others were released from their imprisonment, put in a longboat with their luggage and some provisions, and cast astern. For provisions, they were given 3 small casks of water, 4 bags of bread and 3 pieces of salt beef, and managed to smuggle aboard 2 hams, 2 cheeses and a small keg containing 4 gallons of rum. And for navigation, they received a quadrant and a small pocket compass. The Lady Shore mutineers then sailed away with the ship's surgeon and 66 female convicts. The 29 castaways in the longboat hoisted sail and headed for Rio Grande in Brazil, the nearest settlement on the Portuguese coast of South America, about 480 kilometres away. 2 days later, after being battered by heavy seas and drenching rain, they finally, with the assistance of a boat of people who had seen them from the shore, made landfall near to Rio Grande. It was a miraculous escape, as the locals could not believe that a boat could have survived such weather. The castaways were hospitably received by the locals, and the governor of port at San Pedro promised them a passage to Rio de Janeiro by the first available ship. After a frustrating wait of 7 weeks, with many false starts and the loss of all of his luggage and journals, Black decided to travel north overland to Rio de Janeiro. He left by horseback on the 4th of October 1797 and travelled for about 770 kilometres. Black and the only male convict from the ship, Lyle, caught a whaleboat to St Catherine's, where they found part of the Portuguese squadron of ships anchored. They were well entertained during their stay and left the island for Rio de Janeiro 3.5 weeks later, on the 9th of November 1797, in separate ships. It was to take 10 days for the ships to sail north to Rio de Janeiro, and they arrived on the 19th of November 1797. Before travelling north to Rio de Janeiro, Black had learnt that the Lady Shore had arrived in the enemy's Spanish port of Montevideo in Uruguay, about 500 kilometres south of Rio Grande. The 70 soldiers, the mutineers of the New South Wales Corps, had been jailed, and the female convicts placed in different homes throughout the town. What happened to those women is not known. As the convoy of English ships in the port of Rio de Janeiro would not reach England before 8 months, Black instead decided to join as navigator for Captain William Wilkinson's ship, the Indispensable, that was being used as a privateer, but could also be used as a whaler. The Indispensable sailed down the coast of South America from Rio de Janeiro on the 20th of January 1798. Writing to his father from the Cape of Good Hope on the 15th of April 1798, John Black disclosed that he had just arrived at the Cape after captaining a 10-gun Spanish vessel, La Union, from Malaga to Spain, which Captain William Wilkinson of Indispensable and his crew, including Black, had captured. Over the next 2 months, the cargo of the captured La Union was sold and the ship disposed of. Among the cargo was tallow, candles and dried beef, sought-after commodities in the port. 19-year-old Black invested his share of the windfall in cargo to be sold in Sydney and wrote to his father on the 7th of June 1798, "I have laid in a considerable investment for Port Jackson, which I hope to turn to good account, and I expect to sail tomorrow night." With the strong westerlies along the southern coast of Australia, it would have taken about 2 months for the Indispensable to sail from the Cape of Good Hope to Sydney, and it should have arrived in early August 1798. However, it was a stormy passage across the Indian Ocean and then around the south of Van Diemen's Land when the ship lost 2 boats and 1 man overboard. The same storm stove in 2 boats and carried away several spars. On September 1798, Black wrote to his father, "I am still among the living. By my last letter I informed you of having laid an investment at the Cape for Sydney." Black mentioned that the governor, that is Governor Hunter, was a pleasant, sensible old man. John Black also informed his father of the doubtful monetary dealings in the colony and described the agricultural and natural aspects of the country. He also described the harbour as one of the best in the known world, and that he expected in a fortnight to sail on a cruise for 2 months to catch whales. This was the first time that Black was to go whaling. So not long after they met in August 1798, Mary came under John's protection and fell pregnant almost immediately. However, John Black wasn't long in port. As planned, in late September 1798, his boat, the Indispensable, left to undertake whaling. The Indispensable didn't return until the 27th of October 1798 and left again immediately on a second whaling trip, not to return again until the 29th of December 1798. The Indispensable then needed a refit, and John Black needed to stay in port for a considerable time. So in March 1799, Governor Hunter granted a lease of land to Mr. John Black. This allotment is shown in the map of Sydney on the eastern side of George Street, between Hunter Street and Martin Place. This land was later held in trust for John Black's 2 children and became the land on which Black's son-in-law, Prosper de Mestre, resided and ran his business from. From then on, John Black sailed in and out of Sydney, and Mary Hyde resided on this allotment backing onto the Tank Stream. On the 31st of May 1799, John Henry Black was born at home. Fortunately, his father John Black was home at the time to see his newborn son. and 3 days after the birth of his son, he was again at sail. John Black's business saw him sailing in and out of the port of Sydney, and as a result, their son was not baptised until he was 3 months old. It was reported that the Indispensables sailed for whaling on the 3rd of June 1799. David Collins wrote, "About this time the Indispensables sailed on her fishing voyage. There is no record of her return to port, but it had to have been before the baptism of Black's son on the 2nd of September 1799. It was not long after that Black again left his family and sailed back to Cape Town from Sydney in what was regarded as the shortest passage time-wise." After arriving in Cape Town some months later, John Black became engaged in an adventure that continued to keep him away from his family. He was engaged for the first time as a captain on the privateer Chance that was owned by Michael Hogan. As Spain was then at war with England, Black was engaged to sail from Cape Town seeking Spanish ships. His mission was successful, and on the 8th of July 1800, a Spanish brig arrived in Cape Town. After taking his share of the spoils from the sale of the Spanish brig and its cargo, Black took command of the brig Harbinger, owned by Michael Hogan. Carrying a cargo of 13,000 litres of spirits and 14,000 litres of wine, in November 1800, Black began to sail back to Sydney and his family. In an aside, in 1800 it's recorded that Mary Hyde and her son were off the government stores, and this was because Mary was living on the lease of Mr. Black. She had 7 sheep, 4 pigs and 3 goats, and was able to meet a level of self-sufficiency, something the government greatly encouraged in an effort to cut costs. So John Black headed across the Indian Ocean for Sydney with instructions to take the shortcut through the newly discovered Bass Strait. He followed in the wake of the brig, the HMS Lady Nelson, the first ship to sail eastward through the newfound Bass Strait. The Harbinger embarked on an investigation of the strait, tracking along Cape Otway, Cape Dangar and Cape Patton down to the northern part of King Island and around Wilson's Promontory. Black had sheltered near 2 small islands, which he named the New Year Isles, and then sailed on and named the larger island King Island after Governor Philip Gidley King. He also named Harbinger Rocks and the Hogan Group of Islands. A chart drawn later by Governor King shows John Black's course through the Bass Strait. Governor King's report on the voyage reads, "A small brig from the Cape of Good Hope, commanded by Mr. Black, a person of good abilities as a surveyor and navigator, passed through and keeping more to the southward made Cape Albany Otway, and standing to the southward made an island lying in the centre of the west entrance of the strait, which he named King Island, and afterwards passed through the centre of the strait, unadvisable to attempt from the east, only from the west." John Black arrived in Sydney on the 11th of January 1801, after being away for 14 months, at which in this time Mary Hyde became pregnant with their second child. This was the beginning of his longest time in port with his family, and it lasted nearly 12 months, from the 11th of January 1801 to the 1st of January 1802, when he entered into the liquor trade and established a shop on his leased land. Black discharged his cargo of rum and wines in Sydney into the warehouse that the businessman Simeon Lord had built specifically for this purpose. In selling his cargo, Black had entered Sydney's liquor trade. Black also negotiated with Governor King to sell the Harbinger to the governor on behalf of its owner. On the 7th of September 1801, Governor King granted Mary Hyde an absolute pardon 18 months before her sentence would have expired. John Black and Mary Hyde's second child, Mary Ann Black, was born on the 1st of October 1801. On the 1st of January 1802, John, 23 years old at the time, left Sydney again. He was employed as the captain of the Campbell's & Co. brig Fly, sailing from Mumbai and then Kolkata to pick up goods from India for the Sydney warehouses of Robert Campbell. Black managed to make the voyage up the east coast of Australia, above New Guinea, through the islands of Indonesia and across to Mumbai and then Kolkata in very good time. In April 1802, the Fly departed Kolkata for the return voyage to Sydney. It left on the 14th of May 1802 and continued to sail south across the Indian Ocean, along the bottom of Australia, through the Bass Strait above Tasmania and up the east coast to Sydney. However, sometime after the 14th of May 1802, the ship was lost at sea with all hands, if not on its passage across the Indian Ocean, then somewhere in the stormy and iceberg-strewn ocean below southern Australia. News did not reach Sydney until 12 months later that Black's ship was missing. News of the probable loss of the Fly was reported by Captain Alan McCastle of the Castle of Good Hope when it arrived in Sydney in February 1803 to find that the Fly had never arrived. The ship news in the Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser on the 5th of March 1803 reported the loss. We have been informed of the more than probable loss of the Fly, a vessel laden with piece and other valuable goods, also bound for this place and belonging to the house of Campbells at Calcutta. She left Calcutta in the month of April in 1802 and has not since been heard of. It was commanded by Mr. John Black, a young man much esteemed here by all who knew him. John Black's death was not publicly confirmed until April 1804, when the ship news and the Sydney Gazette and New South Wales Advertiser reported, "The brig Fly, Captain Black, that sailed from Calcutta for this colony in April 1802 has never been heard of." Mary was not left completely destitute when Black sailed in January 1802. She had the house and the shop on the land leased in Black's name and what remained of the money and supplies that Black had left behind before he had sailed. In about 1805, Hyde began a new relationship with a business associate of her late partner, Simeon Lord. Simeon Lord became the stepfather to Mary and John's two children. Simeon also brought into the relationship an adopted daughter of his, Joanna, the orphan of two convicts who had died before she was 4 years old. Simeon Lord was the fourth child of Simeon and Anne Lord, and he was born on the 28th of June 1771 at Dobroyd, Yorkshire, England. He was convicted at the Manchester Quarter Sessions in April 1790 of stealing 21 pieces of cloth, 91 metres of muslin and 91 metres of calico from Robert Peel and Associates. As the jury gave the stolen material a nominal value of only 10 pence, Lord escaped with a sentence of transportation for 7 years. He arrived in New South Wales on the 20th of August 1791 on the ship Atlantic. He was Anglican and was assigned as a servant to Captain Thomas Rowley of the 102nd Regiment. He was one of early Sydney's great characters, who in addition to becoming a magistrate also happened to be one of the most litigious men in the colony. Emancipated early and helped by his master, Lord seemed to have begun his mercantile career as one of the shadowy figures who retailed spirits and general merchandise bought in bulk by officers of the New South Wales Corps. Simeon first acquired land about 1793, and by 1800 he owned about 400 acres at Petersham, where he grazed 284 sheep. In September 1798 he bought a warehouse, a dwelling house and other buildings on what is now the site of Macquarie Place. In 1799 he bought a Spanish prize, tactfully renamed her Hunter, and sent her to India with oil, sealskins and New Zealand spars. Her master was supposed to return with an illegal Indian cargo and sold the ship and absconded. In 1800 he was one of the petitioners who sought the governor's permission to buy merchandise direct from the ship Minerva and so to bypass the officer's ring. In the next January he was appointed public auctioneer, and captains of vessels used him increasingly to sell their wares and as a general agent. Profitable though this was, Lord sought for years to import his own cargo, preferably from his own ships. In 1801, the same fate befell another Spanish prize sent to the Cape with coal. Her captain, Hugh Meehan, who was Lord's partner, also absconded with the proceeds. So during the next 20 years, Simeon Lord was a retailer, an auctioneer, a sealer, pastoralist, timber merchant, and ultimately a manufacturer. But probably his most consistent success was as a wholesale merchant and captain's agent. Commissioner John Thomas Bigg commented favourably on Lord's reputation as a captain's agent. He was frequently given power of attorney by New South Wales residents, and he acted for Captain John Piper from 1802 to 1811 as agent and merchant banker. In 1803 he began building the large 3-storey house by the Tank Stream Bridge, which became a Sydney institution. A boon to ship's officers who wished to sleep ashore near their merchandise, it was a rendezvous for captains and supercargoes for the next 20 years. In August 1804, one captain left there merchandise worth £7,000. In January 1805, Simeon Lord formed a partnership with Henry Cable and James Underwood, who for some years had been successful in boat building and sealing. Robert Campbell and Lord had been the first to export oil and sealskins to England in 1803. These valuable staples netted Lord, Cable and Underwood more than £18,000. Lord's share, when added to substantial sales on his private account, brought him more than £20,000. These totals would have been considerably higher if plumbers had not blundered badly. The partnership was almost defunct by the end of 1807 and ended in a welter of lawsuits in which the judgments favoured Lord. With mysterious ingenuity, he contrived to prevent plumbers from extracting $8,000 in debts from the defunct firm until at least 1819. Lord's relations with the governors varied. King approved his sealing enterprise and his trading, which helped to wreck monopolistic activities, but he violently disapproved of Lord's ingenious evasions of the East India Company's monopoly and his close relationships with men like Michael Robinson. When King exiled Robinson to Norfolk Island in 1805, all Lord's threats and pleadings failed to get him back. When the governor left New South Wales, Lord sued him for £5,000 but was non-suited. In 1805, Simeon Lord bought a 200-acre farm he called Brush Farm at the Field of Mars and Sunning Hill Farm as well. He was then exporting wheat and maize to Hobart Town. Already a pioneer in the sealing industry, Lord became interested in wider horizons of the Pacific. In 1803, his little schooner Marcia brought the first cargo of Fiji sandalwood to Sydney. In 1804, he signed articles with Isaac Pendleton of the American Sealer Union for a sandalwood voyage to Fiji and the wood to be sold at Canton, and a China cargo obtained with the proceeds and brought to Sydney for the sale on their joint account. However, Pendleton was murdered and the Union disappeared at Fiji. In 1805, Lord allied himself with Captain Chase of the American Sealer Criterion in a similar arrangement. Governor King sought to prevent this illegal conjunction and was furious when his prohibitions were evaded and the Criterion reappeared in Sydney with a China cargo. Forbidden to land it, Chase took it to America, where its sale netted Lord $30,000. In 1806, Lord's adopted daughter Joanna married one of his business partners, Francis Williams, when she was no more than 14 years old. Also in 1806, Mary's first child to Lord was born. Mary and Simeon went on to have 8 children of their own over the next 15 years. Governor Bligh had little sympathy for colonial enterprise and was soon at enmity with Lord and unjustly imprisoned Lord with Cable and Underwood in 1807. Consignments of skins and oils established his credit in London, and he bought the Sydney Cove that brought convicts to Australia in 1807. The government may never have known that an ex-convict owned her, for the strict instructions on behalf of the East India Company to governors against overseas trading by New South Wales residents compelled her ownership to be disguised. So Lord mortgaged his ship to plumbers and registered her in their name. Similarly, Lord, Cable and Underwood owned the Commerce in 1807, but carefully had her mortgaged to Alexander Burney and Co. of London before permitting her departure from Sydney. In 1807, Lord also secretly brought a share in the Sealer Brothers and in the Madras country ship General Wellesley. His ambition was to import English, Indian and China cargoes on his own account, and clandestine ownership seemed to solve most of the English and India problems. To obtain a China cargo, he first sought to join with Americans in the sandalwood trade, the one staple he could provide, which the Chinese merchants valued. Lord's name was fifth on the requisition to Major George Johnston to arrest Bligh in 1808. At loggerheads with John MacArthur, a sealing and sandalwood competitor, Lord was on good terms with Lieutenant Governors Joseph Fourveau and Patterson after MacArthur sailed for England. In 1808, with Thomas Moore and Dr. John Harris, he bought the prize Pegasus and sent her sealing, and in the next year chartered the Boyd to take skins to England. On her way, her captain was to open a trade between Sydney and Cape Colony, in which Lord would exchange coal, cedar and New Zealand spars for Cape wines. Lieutenant Governor William Patterson commended his enterprise, but it did not survive the Boyd's destruction by Maoris. In 1810 and 1811, the profits from sealing were declining, the London market was cold, and plumbers were attaching any consignments Lord sent to England to set off against his debts. So the man whose vessels had pioneered Fourvaux Straits and the Antipodes Island abandoned the industry he had done much to establish. In 1810, Lord held 6 grants and 2 leases, including 1,140 acres granted to him by Lieutenant Patterson to pasture 300 cattle and 1,000 sheep. He had formed a partnership in a pastoral business with John and Gregory Blaxland in 1808 that involved joint ownership of 447 cattle and 2,365 sheep. Some of the produce of his farms was probably sold to ships' captains for provision on their ships. Macquarie particularly esteemed Lord and made him a magistrate in 1810 and put him on the Turnpike Trust and regularly had him dine at Government House. In 1812, Lord and Williams formed a separate partnership with John Hutchinson. They advertised for glass blowers in May and a gross and tumblers had been produced by June. In 1813, the partners were seeking apprentices for weaving, spinning, pottery and dyeing. In 1812, Lord lost 5 major lawsuits for a total of £11,500, and a further judgment of £8,000 was given against his old firm in 1813. Although he was awarded £12,000 against Cable, the victory proved fruitless. In the next year, he offered to sell his famous house to the government as a combined courthouse and residence for the judge advocate and his clerks, but this was declined. A prominent subscriber to the racecourse and active on several committees, he was one of the 13 men whose deliberations in 1816 led to the formation of the Bank of New South Wales. In 1813, Lord built a factory at Botany and opened up a fulling mill. His emphasis was now on shoes, hats, harnesses and textiles. On the 27th of October 1814, Mary Hyde finally married her partner Simeon Lord at St Philip's Church in Sydney. Their 5th child was only 1 week old. A witness to the wedding was William Charles Wentworth, the son of magistrate and family friend Darcy Wentworth. In 1815, Simeon Lord was exporting to Tasmania, but lost 2 valuable cargoes, one in a wreck and the other on his brig trial. He was employing 60 convicts and milling and dressing cloth for the government. In 1820, he showed Biggs samples of his textiles, hats, stockings and leather, which the Commissioner estimated as a threat to British manufacturers. He also mentioned that he produced shoes, candles and harnesses. These ventures have been described as premature, but they must have been reasonably successful since the factory was operating long after his death. His last export ventures seem to have been in the 1820s when Francis Short, as partner, was involved in large timber speculations exporting cedar to England. Soon afterwards, his trading activities seem to have ceased, and he appears to have relied increasingly on his pastoral interests and returns from his manufacturing business. In 1826, he told Governor Darling that he employed 20 convicts for upwards of 20 years in tanning and currying leather and manufacturing hats, cloth, blankets, soap and candles. The hat making had not begun until 1811, when Lord and Williams allied themselves with Reuben Uther, a Lord employee who had mastered the craft. Uther withdrew in 1815 to launch his own business, and Lord's hat making was thereafter managed by his stepson, John Black. During the Macquarie period, he acquired property in Tasmania, and in 1820 sought permission to export 200 merinos there. In 1819, his real property outside Sydney, including the 1,500-acre Dobroyd estate between Long and Iron Coves, a 700-acre tract between Liverpool Road and Cooks River, the 2,300-acre Townsend's Retreat on Botany Bay, and the adjoining 620-acre Kings Grove, the 2,170-acre Lord's Folly near South Creek, and a further 135 acres on Botany Bay, the site of his factory. He must have disposed of some land by 1822, when he was said to own a little over 5,000 acres outside Sydney, with only 6 Sydney residents holding more land than him. In 1823, he was granted a further 600 acres adjoining his factory. In the 1820s, the family moved from their city home in Macquarie Place, Sydney, to their country home in Botany, near the site of the factory. Pressed by creditors in the mid-1820s, Lord sought help from Governor Brisbane, with a long list of grievances which were ignored. Governor Darling proved more responsive. In compensation for the loss of land and the buildings bought in 1798 and torn down after 1811 to make Macquarie Place, Lord was awarded £3,000 in cash and £3,500 worth of land at 4 shillings an acre. Thus, Lord found himself possessed in 1828 of an additional nearly 18,000 acres scattered in substantial blocks from Sydney's outskirts through to Orange. Some were sold to help pay off his creditors, who had finally brought him to bay. He seemed to have played little part in public life after 1821, and his death on the 29th of January 1840 was barely noticed by the newspapers. For all of his dubious ethics, its controversies and quarrels, litigations, withered hopes and blighted ventures, Lord's career was no failure. If his plans were over-ambitious for the times or his own resources, he pioneered commerce in Australia and helped to transform a prison farm into a flourishing colony capable of attracting men of capital. With a few others, he strikingly demonstrated what emancipists could achieve in a new country. Like any good man of middle class, after he belatedly married Mary Hyde, he wanted to establish his heirs in comfort and respectability. With investments in Lord's name, they also became one of the richest couples in the colony of New South Wales. Simeon Lord was shrewd, unprincipled, impudent, a formidable litigant, and a centre of controversy for many years, but he was also often generous and capable of bold and imaginative designs. Perhaps Simeon Lord's most remarkable achievement was to found such a notable family. His family were left very well provided and rose to prominence. Upon Simeon's death, Mary had a mourning brooch made, containing her husband's woven hair in a gold setting with a border of half pearls. So Simeon, being the legal holder of the couple's wealth, had died an immensely wealthy man, and under the terms of the will, Mary, a woman, was made executor of the estate. Lord's estate was divided between his wife and 8 children. The youngest at the time was 18. Mary became one of the wealthiest women in the colony as a result. In an article outlining the death of Simeon Lord, it becomes our painful duty to record the death of Simeon Lord Esquire at his residence, Botany Lodge, one of the very few of this colony whose hospitable table for the last 40 years has ever been open to the British officer or invalid of India, the captain of merchant ships from all parts, as well as needy and often ungrateful immigrants, whether at Botany or at Macquarie Place, which he built in 1819, then the best house in the colony. Mr. Lord was an extensive ship owner, merchant and manufacturer of cloth, giving employment to many of the labouring classes who adored him and his good lady Mrs. Lord. Nor were these liberal acts the first trait in his character. He was the first, and by far the largest contributor to the benevolent institutions and every other charity in the colony. Also, the very first to join that valuable institution, the Sydney College, and continue to give his support. Would there were 1,000 such men. In religion, Mr. Lord was of the Church of England, but he was no bigot. The Catholic, Presbyterian and Wesleyan were to him all respected alike. Having reared a large family of 10 children, his 3 daughters were married into families of the first respectability, and it was his pride to give his 7 sons the best education the colony could bestow. Some of them, whom fill the highest commercial stations in the colony, others are married and settled on his immense estates in different parts of this and the sister colony, all amply provided for by this humble individual who come to this colony in its infancy, a mere youth perhaps. In part 2, I'll be covering Mary Hyde's life after the death of her second husband, Simeon Lord, and detail the descendants of Mary Hyde and what became of them.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.